When I first got to the Philippines, I kept waking up early without meaning to. Most mornings it was around 5 or 5:30, sometimes before the sun even came up. And for a few seconds, I'd have that same feeling I had back in Ohio for almost 30 years. That little shot of panic, like I was late for work or forgot something important. It happened almost every morning those first couple weeks. Then I'd hear the electric fan turning beside the bed, hear roosters outside somewhere down the road, and slowly remember I wasn't in America anymore, and I didn't have a job to rush to. The strange thing is, I didn't even realize how tired I was until I stopped living the way I used to. Back in the States, my whole life felt scheduled. Alarm clock, coffee, traffic, work, bills, same grocery store, same gas station, same conversations. Every year felt faster than the one before it, and somewhere in my late 50s, I started feeling like my life had turned into maintenance. Not living, just maintenance. Maintaining the house, maintaining the truck, maintaining the insurance payments, maintaining the routine. Even weekends didn't really feel like rest anymore because Sunday night was always sitting there waiting for you. I don't think I was depressed exactly. I still laughed, still paid my bills, still went out sometimes. But I remember sitting in my kitchen one winter during a snowstorm watching the news talk about inflation and layoffs and retirement, and I had this thought that honestly scared me a little. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt calm. Not happy. Calm. That's different. And the weird part is, nothing was actually wrong with my life on paper. I had worked hard. I had decent savings. My Social Security was coming eventually. My kids were grown. I should have felt like I made it through the hard part. But instead, I just felt worn down all the time, like life had slowly turned into something heavy I carried around without noticing anymore. I didn't move to the Philippines chasing some fantasy. It honestly started because I was sitting on YouTube too much at night watching videos of people living overseas, and for the first time in years, I saw people that didn't look rushed. That's what caught me. It wasn't beaches or pretty girls or cheap beer. It was the pace. People sitting outside talking, kids playing basketball in the street, somebody grilling food beside the road while music played somewhere in the background. Nobody looked like they were sprinting through life the way everybody back home seemed to be. At first, I thought it was probably all fake internet stuff. You know how YouTube is. Everybody's life looks perfect online. But the more videos I watched, especially the simple ones where people were just walking through neighborhoods or sitting in small restaurants talking about daily life, the more I started wondering what it would actually feel like to live somewhere that didn't constantly make you feel behind. And honestly, that thought stayed in my head for almost 2 years before I ever got on a plane. Then one night I remember sitting in my recliner after work with the TV on and not really watching it. I had one of those frozen dinners sitting on the little table beside me, the kind you heat up for 6 minutes, and somehow the middle is still cold. Snow outside. Dark by like 5:15 in the afternoon. I can still remember looking around my apartment thinking, is this really it now? Not in some dramatic way either, just honestly asking myself if this was what the rest of life was supposed to feel like. Wake up, work, pay bills, wait for weekends, repeat until your body gives out. And the thing is, I wasn't broke. That's what people don't understand sometimes. I wasn't homeless or desperate or going through some huge crisis. I had done okay for myself. I worked most of my adult life, missed birthdays because of work, worked overtime, took the safe path every time because that's what you're supposed to do when you grow up. But somewhere along the line I realized I had spent so much time building a stable life that I forgot to actually enjoy it. I think that's why the Philippines got into my head the way it did. It started small. just random videos online at night after work. Somebody walking through a market in Cebu. Somebody eating at a little roadside place somewhere in Dumaguete. Tricycles going past. People laughing outside plastic tables drinking beer. Rain hitting tin roofs during brownouts. Normal stuff. But every person in those videos looked lighter somehow, like life wasn't squeezing the air out of them every day. At first, I told myself it was all vacation energy. You know, the same way people go to Hawaii for a week and think they could live there forever. But the more I watched, the more I noticed something different. People weren't showing luxury. Most of the apartments honestly looked simple, sometimes rough even. Electric fans instead of central air. Dogs barking outside. Roosters screaming at 4 a.m. Extension cords running across walls. But the people themselves seemed calmer than anybody I knew back home. And I remember one video specifically. This older American guy was sitting outside a little place eating grilled chicken and rice while kids were playing basketball nearby and karaoke was going somewhere in the background. Nothing special was happening. That's what stuck with me. Nobody was trying to impress anybody. Nobody cared about status or careers or who drove what truck. The guy just looked peaceful, sitting there, drinking a San Miguel, watching the neighborhood move around him. That stayed in my head for months. Then, one winter morning, I was scraping ice off my windshield before work, and my hands hurt so bad from the cold, I actually laughed out loud standing there in the parking lot. Not because anything was funny, more because I suddenly had this thought hit me like, man, I really do not want to spend the rest of my life like this. That was probably the first real moment where the idea stopped feeling like fantasy and started feeling possible. I started researching quietly after that, mostly late at night. Cost of apartments, visa stuff, healthcare, YouTube videos, Reddit, Facebook groups. Some people made it sound like paradise. Other people made it sound horrible. Scams, brownouts, flooding, corruption, heat, lonely old foreigners drinking themselves to death. I saw all of it. But even with the negative stuff, I still couldn't stop thinking about it. I think because deep down, it wasn't really about the Philippines anymore. It was about wanting my life to feel different before I got too old to change it. And honestly, the part that scared me the most wasn't moving overseas. It was the idea of never trying at all. I didn't tell anybody at first either. That's probably the part that sounds strange now looking back, but for almost a year, this whole thing just lived quietly inside my head while I kept going to work every day, pretending my life was completely normal. I'd sit in meetings talking about budgets or schedules or whatever problem everybody was stressed about that week. And meanwhile, part of my brain was thinking about places I'd never even seen in person yet. Dumaguete, Cebu, Iloilo. Little names on a map halfway across the world. I finally brought it up to my brother one night when we were out eating wings at this sports bar we used to go to sometimes. I remember he actually stopped chewing and looked at me like I'd just told him I was joining the circus. "The Philippines?" he said. "Why the hell the Philippines?" And honestly, I didn't even know how to answer him. Because it wasn't one thing. It wasn't beaches. It wasn't dating. It wasn't retirement math. It wasn't escaping America, like people online always say. It was harder to explain than that. I just knew every time I looked at videos from there, I felt calmer than I did sitting in my own apartment back home. That's a weird feeling when you're almost 60 years old. Realizing a place you've never been somehow feels more peaceful than the place you've lived your whole life. Most people thought I was joking anyway. And to be fair, maybe part of me thought I was joking too. But then one day, I was sitting at work during lunch staring at another spreadsheet, and I remember opening my phone and looking up flights almost without thinking about it. just curious, just seeing prices. That's what I told myself anyway. 3 months later, I was standing in an airport with 2 suitcases and sweating through my shirt before I even got on the plane. I still remember that flight because I barely slept the whole way there. Your mind starts doing weird things when you're about to completely change your life. 1 minute I'd feel excited, and the next minute I'd think, what am I doing? I remember looking around the airport during one of the layovers, seeing families and business travelers and younger backpacker types, and thinking I was probably the oldest idiot there about to go make a giant mistake. And honestly, the first couple days in the Philippines did not feel magical. Nobody tells you that part. I landed in Cebu, and the first thing that hit me was the heat. Not normal summer heat either. It felt like somebody threw a hot, wet blanket over my entire body the second I walked outside. My glasses fogged up instantly. My shirt stuck to my back within 5 minutes. Traffic everywhere. Horns, motorbikes, people moving in every direction at once. After almost 20 hours of traveling, my brain felt cooked. Then there was the noise. That's another thing people online don't prepare you for. The Philippines is loud, roosters, karaoke, dogs barking, tricycles, music. Somebody hammering something at random hours for reasons you never figure out. The first night in my hotel, I barely slept because I kept hearing motorcycles outside and this rooster that sounded personally offended by life starting at like 3:30 in the morning. I actually remember laying there thinking, okay, maybe I made a huge mistake. And honestly, if I had flown back home during that first week, I probably would have told everybody the same thing most tourists say. Too hot, too chaotic, too noisy, too different. But then little things started happening, small things. And honestly, those little things are the reason I stayed. The first one I remember was this tiny restaurant near where I was staying. Nothing fancy. Plastic chairs, menu taped to the wall, one electric fan barely fighting for its life in the corner. I went in mostly because I was tired and didn't know where else to eat. This older Filipina woman came over smiling and handed me the menu, and I remember apologizing because I didn't really understand what half the food was. Instead of acting annoyed, she actually pulled up a chair beside me and started explaining everything one item at a time like she had nowhere else to be. This one's sweet. This one little spicy. This good with rice. You try this. Just patient, warm, no rushing. And I remember realizing something sitting there, eating that meal. Back home, almost every interaction felt transactional by that point in my life. Grocery stores, restaurants, work, everybody moving fast, everybody tired, everybody staring at phones. But here, people still actually talk to each other, even strangers. The food came out on this little metal tray with rice piled on one side and grilled pork with some kind of vinegar dipping sauce I'd never had before. I still remember sitting there sweating through my shirt with the fan blowing warm air at me, thinking it was one of the best meals I'd had in years. Not because it was fancy, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing through it. That became one of the first changes I noticed after being in the Philippines a while. People sit. That sounds simple, but in America I felt like everybody was always halfway leaving, even while they were talking to you. Eating while checking emails, conversations while looking at watches. Everything moving toward the next thing before the current thing even finished. But here, people would sit outside stores for hours just talking. Families eating together slowly. Neighbors standing outside at night, laughing while kids ran around the street. Nobody acting like every second had to be productive. At first, honestly, it made me uncomfortable, I remember sitting outside a little convenience store one evening, drinking a beer and feeling guilty about it. Guilty for doing nothing. That's how programmed I was after years of work. Part of me kept thinking I should be accomplishing something, cleaning something, answering something, planning something. Instead, I was just sitting there watching tricycles go by while some guy played soft Filipino music on an old speaker nearby. And slowly, that feeling started fading. I think that was the beginning of me changing a little without realizing it. The other thing that surprised me was how quickly people noticed me. Not in a celebrity way or anything stupid like that. More like people actually acknowledged each other here. The security guard outside the grocery store would nod every morning. The lady at the laundry place remembered my name after like 2 visits. The guy selling bottled water downstairs started asking where I was from and if I was adjusting. Okay. Back home, I had lived in the same apartment complex for almost 6 years and barely knew anybody's name. Here, people I'd met once were already calling me sir or boss or asking if I'd eaten yet. And honestly, that messed with me a little emotionally because I didn't realize how invisible I had started feeling in America until people here treated me like I mattered again. Not because I was rich either. I want to make that clear because people online always turn everything into money. Yes, my dollars stretch further here. Obviously that helped. My apartment back in Ohio cost more than some entire houses. I looked at renting in the Philippines. A meal that would cost me $18 back home might cost $3 or $4 here. I remember converting prices in my head constantly that first month and almost laughing sometimes. But the money wasn't the biggest difference. The biggest difference was how life felt day to day. I'd wake up in the morning and hear people outside already moving around. Somebody sweeping, somebody cooking breakfast. Kids walking to school in uniforms, tricycles buzzing down the road, dogs sleeping in the middle of the street like they owned the place. There was this feeling that life was happening around you instead of everybody hiding inside their own little boxes all day. One morning, maybe 3 weeks after I arrived, I walked down to buy coffee just after sunrise, and there was this older Filipino guy sitting outside a little store, smiling at everybody walking by. Didn't matter who it was, kids, construction workers, old ladies. Everybody got the same little smile and nod like he was genuinely happy they existed. I remember thinking, when's the last time I saw somebody do that back home? Probably years. And the strange thing is, the Philippines wasn't easier. That's important. A lot of people online sell this fantasy that moving overseas solves all your problems. It doesn't. I still had stress. I still worried about money. I still had lonely days. I still missed my kids. There were days the internet barely worked. Brownouts, visa stuff, heat that made you feel exhausted by noon. I got food poisoning once so bad I honestly thought I might die in that apartment bathroom. There were moments I questioned the whole decision, but even on the hard days, I still felt more alive than I had back home. That's the part that's difficult to explain to people unless they've experienced it themselves. I remember one night, maybe 2 months after I moved, there was a brownout that lasted almost the entire evening. I was in my apartment trying to watch YouTube when everything suddenly clicked off all at once. Fans stopped, air conditioning stopped, internet gone. Just silence for a second and then dogs barking outside like they knew it happened too. Back in the States, something like that would have ruined my whole night. I would have been irritated immediately, probably checking power company websites and complaining about it. Instead, I walked outside because honestly, the apartment was too hot to sit in. And that's the moment I think something really shifted for me. The entire neighborhood was outside. Kids running around with flashlights. People sitting on plastic chairs beside the road talking. Somebody grilling food under one of those little battery lights. Music playing quietly somewhere farther down the street. A couple older guys drinking beer, laughing about something. Nobody acting angry. Nobody freaking out. It was just life continuing a different way for a while. One of my neighbors waved me over like it was the most normal thing in the world. I barely even knew these people at that point. But next thing I know, I'm sitting there sweating in the dark, eating grilled fish with my hands, while people switched back and forth between English and Visayan around me. Somebody handed me a San Miguel. Somebody else asked if America had brownouts too. Everybody laughed when I said if power went out this long, back home people would probably call the news station. And I remember sitting there realizing I hadn't thought about work once the entire evening. Not once. No checking emails. No doom scrolling. No TV noise in the background. Just people sitting together because there wasn't really anything else to do. And honestly, it felt good. Simple, but good. That was the strange thing about the Philippines. A lot of the comforts I thought I needed started mattering less over time, not immediately. I'm not pretending I suddenly became some enlightened person living with no air conditioning and smiling through every inconvenience. I still complained sometimes, still got frustrated. There were days the heat made me miserable, days traffic made me insane, days I'd stand in line somewhere dealing with paperwork thinking, how can one thing possibly take this long? But little by little, I stopped needing life to feel perfectly controlled all the time. I think in America, I spent years trying to eliminate inconvenience from my life. Faster internet, faster car, faster checkout lines, faster everything. But even with all that convenience, people still seemed exhausted and unhappy most of the time. Meanwhile, here I was sitting on a plastic chair in the dark during a blackout, feeling calmer than I had in years. That really stayed with me. Another thing nobody tells you before moving overseas is how emotional the quiet moments become. Not the exciting moments, the ordinary ones. I remember one morning during the rainy season, I was sitting under this little awning, drinking coffee, watching rain hit the road so hard it almost looked white. Motorbikes pulling over, people running under roofs laughing, water pouring off tin roofs into the street. And for some reason I suddenly got emotional sitting there. Not sad exactly. More like I realized how long it had been since I slowed down enough to even notice life happening around me. Back home, my brain always felt loud, constantly thinking ahead. Bills, retirement, politics, work, health insurance, news. Everything felt heavy all the time. Even relaxing didn't really feel relaxing because part of your mind was always preparing for Monday again. But there in that moment, my biggest concern was honestly just whether the rain would stop before I had to walk home. And that felt unbelievably freeing. Of course, not everything magically became perfect after that. There were lonely nights too. That's another thing people don't talk about honestly enough online. You can move to the other side of the world and still bring yourself with you. I remember my first Christmas there especially. Seeing families together everywhere. Karaoke, decorations, kids running around excited. And meanwhile, I'm sitting alone in my apartment video, calling my daughter back in the States, trying not to look emotional, because I suddenly realized how far away everybody I loved actually was. That's the trade-off nobody can explain to you beforehand. You gain something, but you also give something up. I remember after that call with my daughter, I ended up walking outside because I couldn't really sit in the apartment anymore. It was Christmas Eve, and everywhere you looked, people were together. Music playing, families eating outside, kids carrying little lanterns around, somebody singing karaoke badly somewhere down the street. like their life depended on it. And I'll be honest, for a few minutes, I really questioned everything, because loneliness hits different when you're overseas. Back home, if you feel lonely, you can still drive somewhere familiar. Go to your brother's house, meet an old friend, visit places connected to your life. But when you're sitting alone in another country, thousands of miles away from everybody you've known your whole life, it can hit hard. I remember thinking maybe I got too carried away chasing this idea of a different life. Then something happened that I still think about all the time. There was this knock at my door, and when I opened it, my neighbor was standing there holding a paper plate covered in foil. I barely even knew her at that point. We had only talked maybe a few times in passing. She smiled and said, "Sir, you eat with us tonight, okay?" That was it. No big speech, no awkwardness, just simple kindness. I tried saying I didn't want to intrude, and she looked genuinely confused by the idea. "Christmas?" she said. "Nobody alone." So I went. And honestly, that night changed something in me. It wasn't fancy. Plastic chairs in a small apartment packed with people, kids sleeping on couches, food covering every surface in the kitchen, electric fans pushing hot air around while everybody laughed and talked over each other. I probably only understood half the conversation all night because people kept switching between English and Visayan so fast my brain couldn't keep up. But nobody cared. They still kept handing me food, asking questions, making jokes, pulling me into pictures. At one point, somebody handed me a microphone for karaoke, and I completely embarrassed myself singing some old country song while everybody laughed so hard they could barely breathe. And for the first time since arriving in the Philippines, I stopped feeling like a visitor. That was the moment. Not beaches, not cheap rent, not tropical weather. That. Feeling included somewhere again. I think a lot of people in America are lonelier than they even realize, especially once you get older. Kids grow up, friends get busy, neighborhoods change. Everybody stays inside. You can go days without a real conversation that isn't connected to work or buying something. And I didn't fully understand how empty that had started making me feel until I experienced something different. That's probably why the Philippines affected me the way it did. People here still make room for each other. Not perfectly, obviously. I'm not pretending everybody walks around smiling all day holding hands. There's gossip, drama, poverty, stress. Same as anywhere else. But there's still this feeling that life is shared instead of isolated. Neighbors know each other. Families actually spend time together. People sit outside and talk. And after a while, that starts changing you too. I noticed it slowly. I stopped checking my phone constantly. Stopped feeling guilty for relaxing. Stopped thinking every minute of the day needed to be productive. Back in America, I used to feel anxious doing nothing. Even on weekends, I always thought I should be catching up on something. Cleaning, working overtime, planning retirement, fixing something around the apartment. In the Philippines, I started having afternoons where I'd just sit outside drinking coffee, watching people walk by, and somehow that felt like enough. That sounds small, but for me it wasn't small at all. It felt like getting part of myself back that I didn't even realize I lost somewhere along the way. After that Christmas, something changed in the way I moved through daily life there. Before that, I still felt like somebody passing through. Like maybe eventually I'd go back home, and this whole experience would become one of those stories you tell people later in life. But after sitting in that tiny apartment eating Christmas dinner with people who barely knew me a few months earlier, the Philippines stopped feeling temporary. I started building routines without even noticing it. Every morning I'd walk down the same road to get coffee, and after a while, the lady working there stopped asking what I wanted. She'd just smile when I walked in and start making it. Sometimes I'd sit there an hour just watching people pass outside while tricycles buzzed by and dogs slept under plastic tables. Nobody rushed you out. Nobody cared if you stayed a while. That took me time to get used to, too. Back home, everything feels timed. Buy your coffee. Move along. Next customer. But here people linger. Conversations stretch out. A quick trip to buy bread somehow turns into 30 minutes talking about weather or basketball or somebody's cousin working overseas in Dubai. And somewhere during those first months, I realized I had started smiling more. Not fake smiling either. Real smiling. I wasn't carrying that constant pressure in my chest anymore all the time. The funny thing is, my actual life probably looked less impressive than it did back in America. Smaller apartment, older furniture, slower internet, more inconveniences. But mentally I felt lighter almost every day. That's hard to explain to people who think happiness always comes from upgrading everything around you. Sometimes it comes from needing less. One thing that really surprised me after living there a while was how quickly the days stopped feeling separated from each other in this stressful way. Back home, every week felt divided into categories: work days, weekends, vacation days, everything controlled by the clock. You spent most of your life waiting for the small part where you were finally allowed to relax. In the Philippines, life felt more blended together somehow. I'd wake up early because the sun comes up fast there. By 6 in the morning, people are already outside sweeping sidewalks or cooking breakfast or walking to work. I started liking mornings again. Back in Ohio, mornings felt aggressive. Alarm clocks, cold weather, traffic reports. But there, my mornings usually started with hearing birds outside and motorbikes somewhere down the road, while sunlight came through those thin curtains, way earlier than I wanted. Most days I'd walk to this little coffee place about 10 minutes from my apartment. Tiny place, plastic stools, strong coffee that probably had enough sugar to power a motorcycle. After a while, the guy working there started greeting me before I even sat down. "Morning, Joe." Simple stuff like that started mattering more to me than I expected. There was another little store near my apartment where I'd stop for bottled water or snacks sometimes, and eventually the woman there stopped treating me like a customer and started treating me more like a neighbor, asking if I was eating enough, asking why I looked tired, asking where I'd disappeared to if she hadn't seen me for a few days. I know some people listening probably think that sounds small, but when you spend years feeling invisible, small things stop feeling small. And honestly, there were still days I felt awkward there too. I don't want this to sound fake or overly romantic, because that's not real life either. There were moments I felt old, moments I felt out of place, moments I got frustrated because I couldn't understand paperwork or somebody switched languages halfway through a conversation and I had no idea what was happening anymore. The visa stuff especially got old fast. Every few months it felt like I was filling out another form or standing in another government office, sweating through my shirt, waiting for somebody to stamp something. Sometimes you'd think you brought every document you needed, and then suddenly they wanted another copy of something you'd never even heard of before. Back in America, stuff can be frustrating too, obviously, but at least you usually understand the system you're frustrated with. There were definitely days I walked home annoyed, thinking, why am I doing this again? But then something simple would happen that pulled me right back out of that mood. One afternoon, I remember getting caught in a huge rainstorm walking home from the grocery store. Rain coming down so hard the street started flooding almost immediately. I ducked under this little covered area beside a shop with maybe 6 other people waiting for it to slow down. And within 5 minutes, everybody was talking. not staring at phones, talking. One older guy asked where I was from. Another guy joked that the rain was stronger because I brought American weather with me. Everybody laughed. Somebody offered me food out of a plastic bag. A kid standing there asked if basketball was really popular in America. We ended up standing there almost 40 minutes while rain hammered the street, and honestly, by the end of it, I felt like I'd spent time with friends, even though I'd never met any of them before. That kind of thing happened constantly there. People included you. And after enough time passes, you slowly stop feeling like you're visiting. You start feeling rooted. I think that was the biggest surprise for me, because originally I told myself I was only staying 6 months, maybe a year at most, just long enough to reset my head a little and experience something different before eventually going back home. But then months started passing, and the strange thing was, I didn't really want to leave anymore. Back in America, I used to count time constantly, counting work years until retirement, counting vacation days, counting weekends. But there, I stopped counting so much. Life just started feeling more present, not easier, not perfect, just more real somehow. I remember the first time I went back to the States after living in the Philippines for almost a year. I thought it was going to feel amazing, comfortable, familiar, like slipping back into my old life again. Instead, it felt strange almost immediately. The airport felt loud in a completely different way than the Philippines. Not noisy, more tense, everybody moving fast, nobody making eye contact, people irritated before they even got where they were going. I remember standing in line for coffee, watching some guy get genuinely angry because they messed up his order, and thinking, man, I used to feel like that all the time. And maybe I did. That trip back home really showed me how much I had changed without realizing it. The weird thing was, America still looked exactly the same. Same roads, same stores, same restaurants, same sports commercials playing on TVs above bars. But I didn't feel the same moving through it anymore. Everything felt rushed, even conversations. I'd meet old friends for lunch, and within 10 minutes, everybody was talking about work stress or bills or politics or how expensive everything had gotten. And I'm not judging that because I used to sound exactly the same way. But after spending almost a year living somewhere slower, it suddenly hit me how much anxiety people carry around back home without even noticing anymore. One afternoon during that visit, I went into a grocery store and caught myself staring at an entire aisle of cereal boxes for like 2 straight minutes. Hundreds of choices, bright lights, huge carts full of stuff people probably didn't need. And for some reason, I suddenly felt exhausted standing there. That's when I realized something important. I didn't miss my old life as much as I thought I would. I missed people. That's different. I missed my kids, my brother, certain foods, certain memories. But I didn't miss the pace. I didn't miss the constant pressure. I didn't miss feeling like life was something I was barely keeping up with all the time. And honestly, the moment that really surprised me was when my return flight landed back in the Philippines. The second I walked outside and felt that heavy, humid air hit me again, I actually relaxed. That shocked me. A place that originally felt chaotic and overwhelming now felt familiar. I remember getting into a taxi and hearing karaoke somewhere outside while motorbikes moved around us in traffic, and thinking, okay, I'm back. Back, not visiting. Back. That was probably the moment I finally admitted to myself this wasn't temporary anymore. And look, I want to be honest about something, because people online sometimes turn moving overseas into this fantasy where every day becomes peaceful and meaningful and cheap. and easy. That's not real life. I still have frustrating days here. There are days the heat drains every ounce of energy out of me. Days the internet cuts out right when I need it. Days paperwork makes me insane. Days I miss my family so much it physically hurts a little. There are moments you feel very far from home because you are very far from home. And getting older overseas comes with its own fears too. Healthcare is cheaper here, yes? That part is true. I've gone to clinics and paid less than I used to pay for basic appointments in America. Dental work especially shocked me. But there's also this understanding in the back of your mind that if something really serious happened medically, you'd probably want to be back in the States. That reality never completely leaves you. And there's loneliness sometimes too, even after building friendships. People imagine moving abroad means escaping yourself somehow. You don't. If you were anxious before, you'll still have anxious days here. If you were lonely before, that feeling still follows you sometimes. Geography doesn't magically heal everything inside you. But I'll say this honestly. For the first time in a very long time, my life actually feels like my own again. Not optimized, not impressive, not perfect, just mine. And at this age, that means more to me than I ever expected it would. I think that's what finally changed for me after living in the Philippines a while. I stopped feeling like I was performing my life all the time. Back in America, I always felt like there was this invisible scoreboard running in the background. How much money you make, what kind of car you drive, whether you own a house yet, whether you're successful enough for your age, whether you're falling behind everybody else. Even relaxing started feeling competitive somehow. People bragging about being busy like exhaustion was some kind of achievement. And I was part of that too for years. I remember conversations where somebody would ask how you were doing, and before you even realized it, you'd start talking about work or stress or how crazy life had been lately. Like struggling had become proof you were important. But in the Philippines, I started meeting people who had way less materially than almost anybody I knew back home, and somehow still seemed more at peace. That really forced me to think about what I actually wanted the second half of my life to look like. Not the impressive version, the real version. And honestly, the answer turned out to be much simpler than I expected. I wanted mornings that didn't start with anxiety. I wanted enough time to notice my own life while I was still living it. I wanted neighbors who knew my name. I wanted conversations that weren't always about work. I wanted evenings where I could sit outside with a coffee or a beer and not feel guilty for slowing down. That's really it. And maybe that sounds boring to some people. 10 years ago, it probably would have sounded boring to me too. But once you spend enough years exhausted, peace starts looking a lot more valuable than excitement. One thing I noticed after living there longer is how little moments started mattering more than big experiences. Tourists come to the Philippines chasing huge moments, beaches, island hopping, bucket list stuff. And those things are great. I've done some of them too. But the moments that actually stayed with me were usually ordinary. A kid waving at me from a tricycle every morning on his way to school. The woman downstairs yelling up to ask if I'd eaten yet. Rain hitting the roof while everybody sat outside waiting for the power to come back. Walking home at sunset while people played basketball in the street and somebody cooked food nearby. Those are the memories that became important. Not because they were dramatic, because they felt real. I think a lot of people reach their 50s or 60s and suddenly realize most of their life was spent rushing toward things they thought would finally make them happy later. Retirement, promotions, bigger houses, more savings. And then one day you look around and realize time moved faster than you expected. That realization hit me hard before I moved overseas. I think that's why I stayed once I got here. Not because the Philippines solved my life, because it helped me slow down enough to actually participate in it again. And honestly, I don't know if I'll live here forever. Maybe eventually health issues pull me back to the States. Maybe family does. Maybe life changes again, because life always changes eventually. I'm old enough now to stop pretending I have everything figured out permanently. But I do know this. The version of me that stepped off that airplane the first week was exhausted in ways he didn't even fully understand yet. And somewhere between the brownouts and the karaoke and the slow mornings and the plastic chairs outside little neighborhood stores, I started feeling human again. Not rich, not successful, not important, just human. And these days, honestly, that feels like enough. Sometimes late at night, I'll sit out on the balcony with the fan humming behind me and hear the neighborhood slowly winding down. Dogs barking somewhere far off. Somebody finishing karaoke even though it's already midnight. Motorbikes getting quieter one by one until eventually all you mostly hear are crickets and the occasional tricycle going past. And every once in a while, I'll think about the version of myself sitting back in that apartment in Ohio years ago, staring out the window during winter, wondering if this was all life was ever going to be. I actually feel bad for that guy sometimes, because he thought he was trapped, and maybe financially he wasn't. Maybe physically he wasn't, but mentally he absolutely was. He had gotten so used to surviving life, he forgot life was supposed to be experienced too. That happens slowly, I think. Nobody wakes up one morning at 58 years old, suddenly miserable. It builds over years, small stress stacking on top of other stress, until eventually you stop noticing how tense you are all the time. Your shoulders stay tight. Your thoughts never quiet down. You feel guilty resting. Even vacations become stressful because you're already thinking about work waiting for you when you get back. I lived like that for years without realizing how much it was draining me. And honestly, the Philippines didn't magically cure that overnight either. The first few months there, I still carried America around inside my head. I still rushed while walking places, still checked emails constantly, still felt anxious when I wasn't being productive enough, still worried about whether I was doing the right thing with my life every 5 minutes. But slowly, the environment around me started changing me. Not through some big spiritual moment either, just repetition. Watching neighbors sit outside talking every night. Seeing families eat together almost daily. Learning that nobody cared how important my old job sounded. Realizing people valued time together more than appearances. Having conversations that lasted an hour and somehow never once touched politics or careers or money. And eventually something inside me loosened. I slept better. My blood pressure dropped. I laughed more. I started noticing sunsets again instead of walking past them, distracted. That sounds cheesy when I say it out loud, but it's true. One thing I really wish people understood about getting older is that eventually your definition of a good life changes. When you're younger, you chase excitement, achievement, recognition. You want stories. You want movement. You want proof your life matters. But somewhere along the line, peace starts becoming more valuable than excitement. And peace is hard to find in a world constantly trying to keep you anxious. That's probably why so many older foreigners end up staying in places like the Philippines once they finally slow down long enough to experience daily life there. It's not just cheaper living. That's part of it, obviously. But deeper than that, Life still feels human there in a way that honestly shocked me after spending decades in America. People still stop and talk. Neighbors still help each other. Families still spend actual time together. You're not constantly treated like a walking transaction. And after a while, that starts healing parts of you that you didn't even realize were tired. Now, don't get me wrong, I still miss things from home sometimes. I miss my kids all the time. I miss certain foods, good Mexican food especially. I miss fall weather. I even miss dumb little things sometimes, like American diners or driving long highways at night, listening to classic rock with the heater running. And there are still days living overseas feels hard, really hard. But if you ask me honestly whether I regret moving here, not even close, because for the first time in decades, I don't feel like my entire existence is built around stress anymore. I wake up slower. I breathe slower. I think slower. And maybe that sounds like a small thing to younger people listening to this. But once you spend enough years exhausted, slowing down starts feeling like freedom. I think the biggest surprise for me now is realizing I'm not constantly waiting for my life to begin anymore. That's really what I was doing back in the States without admitting it to myself. Waiting for retirement, waiting for less stress, waiting for the next vacation, waiting until finances felt safer, waiting until work slowed down, waiting until someday when life would finally become enjoyable again. And one day I realized I was almost 60 years old, still waiting. That thought honestly scared me more than moving across the world ever did, because time starts feeling different when you get older. In your 20s, a year feels long. Even your 30s still feel stretched out ahead of you. But once you hit your 50s, it's like somebody quietly turned the speed up on everything. Years disappear fast. Holidays come around faster. Friends age faster. Parents age faster. You start realizing there are probably more years behind you than ahead of you. That changes how you think. At least it changed me. I stopped asking myself what looked impressive and started asking myself what actually made daily life feel good. And for me, the answer ended up being surprisingly ordinary. A slower morning, a simple apartment, coffee while rain hits the street outside, knowing the people in my neighborhood, having enough money to live without constant panic, but not feeling obsessed with chasing more every second. Feeling present. That word matters more to me now than success, honestly. Present. Because I spent years physically existing in my own life while mentally always somewhere else. Thinking about work tomorrow, bills next month, retirement 10 years away. I was always mentally ahead of my own life instead of actually inside it. The Philippines changed that for me. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. And maybe the strangest part is, my world actually got smaller after moving there. But my life somehow started feeling bigger. Back in America, I had more stores, more convenience, more stuff, more choices, faster everything. But most days felt repetitive and blurry. Wake up, work, recover, repeat. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, my routine became incredibly simple and somehow more meaningful at the same time. Morning coffee, walks through the neighborhood, talking with people, watching daily life happen around me, small dinners, rainstorms, brownouts, basketball noise echoing through side streets at sunset. Normal life. But normal life finally felt alive again. And honestly, maybe that's the real reason some people move overseas later in life. Not because they hate America, not because they're chasing paradise, not because they think another country is perfect. I think a lot of people are just tired. tired of feeling rushed, tired of feeling isolated, tired of feeling like life became something they manage instead of something they experience. I know that's what happened to me, and the Philippines, for all its flaws and frustrations and chaos sometimes, gave me something I honestly didn't think I was going to find anymore at this stage of my life. It gave me room to breathe again. And these days, when I wake up early and hear roosters outside, or somebody sweeping the sidewalk below my apartment, or rain starting somewhere over the neighborhood roofs, I don't feel that panic anymore. I don't feel like I'm late for my life. I finally feel like I'm actually living it. And honestly, maybe that's enough now. That thought would have terrified a younger version of me. Back then, I always thought life needed to become bigger all the time. More money, bigger goals, more achievement, more proof that you were doing well compared to everybody else. That's how a lot of us were raised. Keep climbing. Keep pushing. Keep improving. Don't slow down, because slowing down means you're losing ground somehow. But eventually I started realizing there's no finish line where somebody finally hands you permission to relax. A lot of people spend their whole lives waiting for that moment, and it never really comes. That's one reason I think so many people my age quietly feel exhausted, even if they've technically done everything right. Worked hard, paid taxes, raised kids, saved money, stayed responsible. And yet somehow, they still wake up anxious every morning, wondering why life doesn't actually feel better than they thought it would by now. I understand that feeling because I lived inside it for years. And look, I'm not trying to pretend moving to the Philippines is the answer for everybody listening to this. Some people would hate it here, honestly. The heat alone would drive certain people insane. There are days the humidity feels like you're breathing through a wet towel. Infrastructure can be frustrating. Internet problems, flooding sometimes, visa paperwork, traffic, bureaucracy, noise. You definitely give up convenience living here. And if you're the kind of person who needs total structure and predictability all the time, this place would probably wear you down fast. But for me, the trade-off became worth it. Because somewhere along the way, I realized convenience and peace are not always the same thing. America gave me convenience. The Philippines gave me breathing room. That's the best way I know how to explain it. Breathing room mentally, breathing room emotionally, breathing room financially. Too honestly, I'm not rich here, not even close. But I'm also not trapped in that cycle of constantly feeling behind anymore either. That changes your nervous system after a while. You stop waking up feeling hunted by life all the time. And maybe the biggest thing is this. I stopped feeling alone. That sounds strange because technically I'm farther away from people I've known my whole life than ever before. But loneliness isn't always about physical distance. Sometimes loneliness is spending years surrounded by people while never really feeling connected to anybody. In the Philippines, people pulled me into life again. Neighbors, store owners, families, random conversations during brownouts, basketball games echoing through neighborhoods at sunset, invitations to birthdays and fiestas even when I barely knew anybody there. Tiny moments that slowly built into something that actually felt like community. And I honestly think community is one of the things a lot of us lost somewhere along the way back home. Everybody isolated, everybody stressed, everybody entertained constantly, but somehow still lonely. Living here reminded me humans are actually supposed to spend time around each other. Simple idea, but it changed me. These days, my life would probably look boring to a lot of younger people online. I wake up early, drink coffee, walk around the neighborhood, work a little remotely, talk to people, sit outside at night sometimes doing absolutely nothing while motorbikes go past and dogs bark in the distance. That's most of my life now. And honestly, I love it. Because for the first time in decades, I don't feel like I'm trying to escape my own life anymore. I'm finally comfortable inside it. And maybe that's the real reason I stayed in the Philippines. Not because everything became easier, because somewhere between the noise and the heat and the brownouts and the slow mornings, I finally felt at peace with myself again. These days, I still wake up early most mornings. Not because an alarm forces me to. Usually it's the sound of the neighborhood starting to move around outside. Somebody sweeping the sidewalk. A motorbike starting up somewhere down the road. Roosters yelling like they're trying to personally fight the sunrise. Sometimes rain hitting the roofs before daylight even fully comes up. And every once in a while, I'll lay there for a second and remember the version of me that used to wake up in Ohio already stressed before his feet even touched the floor. Checking the clock immediately, thinking about work immediately, feeling behind immediately. That feeling is gone now. Not every problem, not every worry. I'm still getting older. Life is still life. I still miss people back home. I still have frustrating days here. The Philippines didn't magically turn existence into some perfect, peaceful movie. But it gave me something I honestly thought I had lost somewhere along the way. It gave me time to actually feel my own life again while I'm still living it. And maybe that's really the whole reason I stayed. Not because this place is paradise, not because I escaped reality, but because somewhere between the slow mornings, the conversations outside little neighborhood stores, the brownouts, the noise, the rainstorms, the laughter, and the simple rhythm of daily life here, I stopped feeling like I was racing through my remaining years. For the first time in a very long time, I feel present. And at this stage of my life, honestly, that feels like more than enough.